Hello, everyone. This is your host, Nandini Ray, and you are listening to the Maitri podcast Between Friends Conversations with Maitri. My production team member, Shilpa Sazdev, and I are very happy to present this podcast where we invite distinguished guests to discuss important topics that matter to our community. I will start today's episode with a trigger warning as we are going to discuss an extremely sensitive topic, and that is marital rape. Yes, this is a very difficult topic, and but we must discuss this crime on our show to educate our community members about the issue, to break the stigma associated with help seeking, and to inform our listeners about survivors' rights and options. And also, we will brainstorm community's role in preventing this violent act. We have Krista Colon and Zakia Afrin with us. Krista Colon is the Public Policy Director for the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, where she represents domestic violence programs throughout California at various government agencies, including the California State Legislature. Through this advocacy, Krista ensures that the voices of domestic violence programs and survivors are heard and reflected in public policies. Before joining the partnership, Krista worked at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, focusing on advocating for increases in federal funding for domestic and sexual violence programs and reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. Zakia Afrin has been an advocate for immigrant women for over 15 years in the San Francisco Bay Area, and currently Zakia oversees survivor advocacy programs at Maitri. She is a senior fellow and adjunct professor of international law at Golden Gate University in San Francisco. A social justice activist at heart, Zakia has served on the board of CPEDV from 2013 to 2016 and founded Aditya in 2020, a social and cultural platform for the Bangladeshi diaspora. Thank you so much, Krista and Zakia, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and for hosting this really important conversation today.
Thank you, Nandini, for bringing up this topic. And thank you very much, Krista, for being with us today.
So I think we should start our conversation discussion with a simple question that what is considered marital rape? Because this is really confusing for many. Many people may not understand clearly what is marital rape. So would you please discuss that first?
Sure, I can start. So marital rape or spousal rape is sexual assault and rape within an intimate relationship. And what I think is really important for all of us to know and remember is that being married to someone does not automatically give consent for sex. It does not automatically provide consent on any given day or in any given moment. And so even within a romantic relationship or a marriage, an individual still has a right to say no and to choose not to engage in sexual activity with their partner. And when they're forced to do so, it is rape and sexual assault just the same as it is if we are talking about a stranger who says no to sexual advances. And so I think it's always really important for us to remember that those relationships that we have are not blanket consent to engage in activities.
And if yeah, go ahead, Zakia.
I just was going to say, if I can provide a little bit of context, because this isn't always something that gets talked about, I think it's important to highlight how unfortunately common spousal rape and marital rape is. Some of the data that we have from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence is that between 14 and 25% of women will be sexually assaulted by an intimate partner in their relationship. And that in abusive relationships, about 40 to 45% of women will be sexually assaulted. And those impacts are really devastating. it's most likely that it will occur multiple times within that abusive relationship. And that for women who experience this type of rape, they suffer really severe and long-lasting impacts, both in their physical health and well-being, as well as their mental health and well-being. They're more likely to experience depression and anxiety. And so I just think it's really important for us to know that although we don't often talk about it, I know we'll continue that conversation about why it's not talked about as much. It does unfortunately happen regularly, which makes it so important for a conversation like today's, and that the impacts of it are very serious for women who experience this assault.
It is so frustrating to see that throughout history, until probably the 1970s, most countries granted a husband the right to have sex with his wife whenever he so desired. And it was much later, marital rape has been criminalized in some countries. But I think still 36 countries in the world have not criminalized marital rape yet. And there are so many misconceptions and ambiguity associated with marital rape. So many victims, they don't even understand that what is going on. Should they're suffering, but they don't know whether they can talk about it, though they can seek help. So I think today's discussion is a much needed discussion. And thank you both for being here to talk about this issue. Can you educate our listeners about the current status of marital rape law in the US and California stand on this?
Sure. So currently, every state in the country has laws against marital rape. And that was, work of advocates like organizations like Maitri all across the country pushing for that change and bringing those conversations to their legislature. And much of this work came before I was involved in the domestic violence field, but certainly came at times when legislatures at the state level were likely to be predominantly male-led, right? And so lots of advocates coming in to talk about a very sensitive, important topic and to convince heavily male legislatures to pass legislation to make it clear that this was illegal. Here in California, one interesting thing happening at the moment is that California has had two laws around sexual assault. So there's been a rape statute and then a separate spousal rape statute that came with slightly different language, different penalties if someone was convicted in our criminal courts of raping a spouse. And there's a bill right now sitting on the governor's desk waiting for him to act on that would change California's laws so that the rape of a spouse is treated just the same as the rape of any other person. And one of the things that I found really interesting in this law and taking a close look at our marital rape statute was that it really hinged around the marital relationship. And we know that in 2021 California, there are lots of relationships that are close, intimate relationships that are not marriage, right? Whether they're dating partners or engaged but not yet married, that weren't falling into the spousal rape statute. And so the fact that we still as a state treated rape differently the day you got married, right, as opposed to the day prior for those relationships was an interesting piece to me. So we don't know yet whether or not the governor will sign the bill, but there's been just a lot of really important conversation at the state legislature this year about making sure that we are clear from the state that raping your spouse is no less severe or serious than raping anyone else.
Yeah, that's true. So consent is important, whether you are married or not. So at Maitri, we primarily serve South Asian survivors, and in most South Asian countries, sex and sexuality is a taboo topic. And many women grow up, understanding that they are not allowed to say no to sex to their husbands, or else the husband will have affairs outside, or they will be seen as not good wives. And due to lack of sex education in schools in South Asian countries, many may not have a clear idea that what is healthy sexual relationship, and if they can talk about, if they're feeling uncomfortable in their relationship, if they can talk about these issues outside, they can ask for any help. So I think it is very important that we are talking about this issue openly, and we should, so that people who are suffering in silence, they can get some help, and they can get some information. So Zakia, this is mostly for you, that how does this law legal implication in California for marital rape can impact our clients, South Asian survivors that Maitri mostly served?
Thank you, Nandini. So, first of all, I would like to say something about the concept of rape as we understand it, right? In South Asia and many parts of the world that has gone through a lot of colonial repression and internal strifes with different ethnic groups, different religious groups. Rape brings out a very disturbing and very horrible uh, image for anyone bringing up rape. So that perhaps plays a role when community is talking about rape versus if somebody is talking about marital rape. That because in the way we understand rape, it's always coming from a different group, and as part of war, we have seen it so much happening throughout history. And also as violence against women in general, not necessarily within relationship. And I can give you a couple of examples of how our clients actually responded to a question when we talked about marital rape. Krista, that in the Policy Advisory Council for the past few months, we have had a couple of discussions around this topic because there is a bill and each of us had different different question coming from different, serving different cultural groups. So one of the things I had in mind that in my 15 years of advocacy, not really a large number of women, I cannot think of how many of the individuals that were seeking help from us actually brought up sexual violence. And not to say that it was not happening to them, but it was not something that would come up in a conversation unless we would probe and we will ask very directed questions. So when we took back this marital rape discussion to one of our support group sessions, just in general, trying to understand how our clients are feeling about it, some of the things that we got, I'll just share. One client said that she first thought of it when her child was looking at a good touch and bad touch video that was provided by the school for her to learn. And that's when she first realized that her relationship with the spouse had many of these elements that she was seeing. One of the clients mentioned that the term rape never came to her mind until her lawyer started talking about writing the declaration, asking very specific questions, and talking to her about her options going forward, freeing herself from the abuse. For someone, it came up only during therapy, and the therapist acknowledged that this is what may have happened. So when we are in this confused state ourselves, in that situation, this I don't know how this law would directly help without actually community involvement, our involvement, more of this conversation. So definitely this is a good step that Nandini, you brought this topic up, that let's start this conversation and see where our uncomfortableness lies and address that right away. One of the other things Nandini just mentioned, I also want to reiterate about sex education, right? Many of the South Asian countries, and also not all of the US states, have formalized sex education for children. So the concept of consent is not taught in that sense. Of course, before marriage, there are family conversations sometimes happening, what to expect and what not. But to the extent that one can identify healthy sexual relationship, probably that is somewhere missing. So the third point I wanted to make is this same conversation we took to our volunteer meeting to have a discussion with the staff and volunteers about marital rape, how we are feeling comfortable about talking about this, addressing this, and all of it. And very interesting, we did a poll, and we saw that there is a lot of uncomfortable responses even there. And we are working with clients daily. Our volunteers are all 40-hour trained. They're daily working with clients. And what became clear is that one of the questions that I asked, which came up in the law, that, as you mentioned, that how about the treatment of rape and marital rape differently within the legal system in terms of accountability, account of punishment, and there was almost a half and half split there. And the reason what I feel, and we also discussed about it, is looking at the immigrant population, there is so much of fear about all the consequences, right? For going to the police, reporting a crime, having a spouse behind bars, having a spouse deported, family relationships and all. There's always been underreporting within our communities, even for domestic violence. So something as sensitive as marital rape, how do people really respond when they would say that in spousal rape, the person accused, the rapist, is being treated equally as a stranger rapist, right? The stranger rapist goes to jail for a long time, registered in the sex offenders list, doesn't necessarily impact the victim anymore if provided enough support for rehabilitation and otherwise. However, for a spousal rape situation, that consequences can actually linger on the family for a very long time. So some of those things came up in our discussions, and we are looking to see what comes out of the law, and we are looking at how we all can be on the same page about bringing more awareness about this issue, addressing this issue.
And this is an emotional component of it. I don't think I don't know whether I'm right or wrong, but I personally think that when you are raped by a stranger, it is little bit easier for you to report that abuse than if you're raped by your husband, because there are a lot of emotional connection is there. Probably he's your children's dad. Probably you genuinely love that person and want to have him as your partner, and at that point it will be extremely difficult to report that abuse. And on the same, also, um, lack of, it is shame, guilt, probably, that it's a so private thing that how can you talk about your personal private thing outside. So out of that stigma, that shame, fear, guilt, uh, many women probably don't talk about that abuse, right?
Absolutely. And I think that, the bill that is pending right now, that we're waiting to see what will happen with it, is focused on our criminal system, right? So it's focused on when reports are made to law enforcement, when there's a criminal prosecution. And although that's an important part of the response, I think that it also has opened up a conversation about how are we talking about marital rape in all of the other services and supports that we're offering to survivors, right? Because we know that for survivors healing, it isn't necessarily the criminal system and whether or not the person who's committed any form of domestic violence, including marital rape, is prosecuted, but it's the support they're able to get from programs like Maitri or from other service providers and areas of support that they reach out to. And Zakia, I think what you shared about the discomfort with talking about it, even among staff and volunteers and board, makes total sense and is really telling, right? If we as a field are uncomfortable talking about this, of course, it's not necessarily going to come up in those conversations. And we all live in the same, society that is generally uncomfortable with this topic. I think there's still a lot of societal discomfort in talking about domestic violence generally, right? And then to talk about these specific components. Nandini, as you said, this is so private. It's so personal and it's so complicated, right? There's so many feelings of love. There are deep connections. There are children, perhaps, right? This is a hard piece to talk about. And so I think that, yes, the criminal system and how our criminal law treats this is important, but also how do we talk to domestic violence programs advocates, but also healthcare providers, religious organizations who survivors may turn to, and the general public, right? To be able to acknowledge and support survivors when they do bring up this particular piece of the abuse that they're experiencing is also so important.
Yeah, we have to try our best to break the barrier and to talk about to bring that issue on a public forum so that people can understand that what is happening is wrong and what they can do about it. For example, like marital rape, reproductive coercion is also another hidden form of violence against women where your partner is controlling your reproductive autonomy. And many women may not clearly identify what is going on with them, and well, they're suffering this abuse in silence. So, Krista, I would like you to talk about like what is reproductive coercion and California's legal stand on this.
Sure. So, reproductive coercion can include all sorts of actions to really control your partner's reproductive autonomy. And so, what that can look like in sort of plain language is using force or threat or intimidation to try to pressure another party to become pregnant. So, we hear often, unfortunately, about abusive partners throwing away birth control pills if the woman is on oral birth control, or not using condoms in sex, right? Interfering with the protections that the couple had agreed to prevent pregnancy from happening, trying to force the person to become pregnant. Also, I will say on the other side of that coin, right, forcing and intimidating survivors into the decisions they make if they do become pregnant, right? If that pregnancy is not wanted by the abusive partner, putting pressure on their partner to terminate a pregnancy. And then, of course, trying to control the pregnancy. Unfortunately, pregnancy is also one of the most dangerous times for women when it comes to experiences of domestic violence. It's one of the times when violence is most likely to begin in terms of physical violence. It's one of the most dangerous times for women experiencing abuse. So I think there's a real tie-in between the coercion, the threats, the intimidation that go into controlling how a woman makes those reproductive decisions for herself or how they negotiate it as a couple, right? It should be a conversation that includes both parties. And again, to go back to consent, right? That both parties are agreeing to what will be done. And then the tie-ins to what can happen when someone gets pregnant in an unhealthy or an abusive relationship.
And the coercion is like reproductive coercion can be structural when state policies make contraception and abortion the care inaccessible to some people. They are in effect replicating reproductive coercion on a structural level, and sometimes family also can control. For example, I'm from India, and I have seen many women they are coerced by their husbands or their in-laws to abort when they are carrying girl child. So that is also reproductive coercion, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. All of that is part of it, as is controlling, a person's access to healthcare during a pregnancy, right? For eliminating or impacting their ability to get those ultrasounds to care for the health of an unborn child while they're carrying. And yes, I think what you point out about the way that our society and our family and structural elements also show up in those dynamics is very, very real.
So would you like to discuss some legal policies in California, state policies on this issue?
Sure. There's actually a bill that was just recently signed into law and will go into effect in next year, 2022, in January, around reproductive coercion. And what it does is it adds reproductive coercion into the domestic violence restraining order as an example of the types of coercive, controlling behaviors that an abusive partner may exert through an abusive relationship. And I think this is really important, sort of building on what we've already talked about around bringing this type of abuse out of the shadows, right? Naming it, giving survivors that ability when filing for a restraining order to see this component of the abuse they've experienced named and given an opportunity to speak to it. I think by including it, it also helps educate our judges and our entire court system about this component that otherwise may not have been discussed in cases as survivors were describing the abuse. And I think this is also a really important part in terms of a continued reminder for everyone that domestic violence is much more than just physical violence. Right? That domestic violence is also this type of intimidation and threat and coercion and emotional harm that happens, even if there's not physical violence as part of that or separate from physical violence that may also be occurring, and that both are very important for us to recognize.
Yeah, Zakia, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so when I'm listening to Krista talking about the laws regarding marital rape and now about the reproductive coercion, what's coming up to me is the realization that we always have at the back of our mind, but it just becoming more and more pronounced that law cannot solve all of our problems. The criminal justice system cannot solve our problems. We need to get involved as a community. And throughout the pandemic, in different topics from different areas of activism, this call for community intervention models have come up. And now even the domestic violence field is talking about, how about some community intervention models? And that doesn't necessarily mean that in a violent situation, an advocate will show up. It can have different layers of intervention, bringing our faith leaders in, bringing our community leaders in, talking about these issues to just general members of the community and making people aware. I think that's really a very important parallel strategy that we always have to work on whenever we are talking about legal improvements and new laws to combat domestic violence, marital rape, and other issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I also personally believe that no matter what, and I understand this is a very private matter we are talking about here, and many of us are, uncomfortable even discussing this issue openly. But I also understand that unless all community members invest in prevention efforts, unless all of us, we do something to prevent this kind of crime, then nothing is going to change. So if someone is listening our show today and she is, suffering from marital rape or reproductive coercion, so do you want to give them any message? Do you want to talk about if they have any rights and options, especially if they're immigrants? So what kind of rights and options do they have?
So I want to start by saying that there is support and help available. And I'll ask either of you to share Maitri's contact information and hotline number. But the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. They also, through their website, have a chat feature and a text feature for whatever is safest for people to use when reaching out. And the national hotline can help connect survivors with resources in their communities, both here in California and all across the country. And I couldn't agree more with what Zakia said. Our laws are important. My role is as the public policy director, so I spend a lot of time talking about what our laws do and don't do and how to make them better. But the really deep changes in our communities to stop this violence from ever occurring aren't necessarily going to come through law, right? The culture change is so important and so powerful. And so, what I would say to someone who's experiencing this type of abuse is that it is not okay. This is not something you should have to tolerate, and to reach out, that there are advocates there to help support you in finding resources and the path to well-being that is best for you in your particular situation. And also in terms of the question about immigration, that domestic violence programs work with survivors regardless of immigration status. It is not a question that programs are asking in terms of whether or not services are available. There are also specific immigration protections that may be available to survivors, and to work with advocates and experts on this in terms of your case, but that immigration status should never prevent a survivor from reaching out to organizations like Maitri for help and support.
I intentionally asked you this question, Krista, because I want to, let people know that no matter what they're immigration status, they can reach out to organizations like Maitri, YWCA, ARCI, Next Door Solutions, and their local domestic violence agencies. Because immigration can be controlled as, used as control mechanism, because many abusers, they keep telling victims or survivors that if you report, you will be deported. So out of that fear, many people, they don't call even in an agency. So so for listeners, I would like to say that please call agencies, domestic violence advocacy agencies, and talk to them about and know your rights and options. And it is confidential, it is free. So please call Maitri or other local agencies. Maitri's number is 1-888-8 Maitri, or find any local agency in your area. And so both of you, Zakia and Krista, both of you focused on community involvement to end domestic violence and sexual assault, marital rape, reproductive coercion, violence against women. So can you give us some tips on how we motivate and engage, or how community members can get engaged in or to take leadership in prevention efforts?
I'll go first. I think discussions and in open forums, and bringing some of these topics out of the shadows is the first step, right? We have to acknowledge that in all communities, in our communities and others, domestic violence may exist. And how we respond to it is the most important thing. We cannot just be silent, bystanders. Not to say that we have to intervene when something is happening, but we have to speak up against domestic violence whenever there is an opportunity, and beginning from our own homes, the way we behave with our partners within our relationships in front of our children, the way we talk to children about healthy relationships, that's where it has to begin. Then it moves outside of the household. When our children are going to school, they're learning about relationships. They are going to show what they have learned in their homes. And a home where there is no violence, there is equal partnership between parents, can truly raise a community member who will learn to respect those relationships, those boundaries that people have. That's the first thing. Secondly, when we are going to engage in our civic responsibilities, we are going to vote, we are going to support something, we need to see who is this leader or what policies are we supporting. It's very important. Are we supporting a policy that would tell our city to invest in schools, invest in education that focuses on healthy relationships? Will ask our city to fund local city or the state to fund local domestic violence service providers, and other intersectional needs that people may have. So keeping an eye on those issues are also very important. And lastly, when there is an active call from organizations like us and many others that Krista has mentioned, that there is a complete list of California organization in CPEDV's website, supporting these organizations, either by donating or by volunteering, or just amplifying what we are trying to do, amplify our voices and help us reach community members.
I would echo all of that, and also just say that I think one of the most important things is meeting our communities where they are. And I mean that both literally in a very physical space, especially as we hopefully start to see the end of COVID in our communities and the ability to get back to more in-person activities. But also, we know prevention advocates all across the state have been finding creative ways through social media, through virtual platforms to stay connected with their communities. But being present, showing up at community events to support the community and still do education about not only services for folks who have experienced this type of violence, but also education about healthy relationships, about what it can look like to not experience this type of harm. And I think that one of the things most important for us to remember always is that there's no guarantee that anyone has ever learned what healthy relationships look like or the skills to build them, right? We don't all grow up in homes that are healthy. And so if what we're seeing is what we see at home, what we see on television, right? Those are not always or rarely healthy relationships, healthy versions of what relationships should look like. And even when folks have seen healthy relationships, doesn't necessarily mean that you've learned the skills and the hard work that goes into that, right? You may see it in your parents or in your grandparents or in another family that you are close to, but that hard work of healthy communication, setting boundaries, negotiating consent, isn't always visible to us. And so the importance of that education, both for our young people, of course, but also for our adult population, to help everyone at every age learn how to build those skills and what they have the right to expect from a partner in a relationship, and also what their partner should expect of them, right? So both how we behave in our relationships and what we should expect from the people we're in relationship with.
So mutual respect and open communication is very important to build healthy relationship. So yeah, we are almost time. Thank you, Zakia and Krista, for sharing a wealth of information with our listeners. And listeners, we all can do our part to end violence against women. We all can take part in creating a culture where consent is mandatory, victims are believed and supported, and zero tolerance for gender violence is a norm. Hopefully, that day will come soon. This is your host, Nandini Ray, signing off today. We will be back soon with another community issue. Till then, please catch up with all previous episodes of Maitri Between Friends Conversations with Maitri on SoundCloud and on other podcast apps. Please like and share our podcast as we need your support to engage more people like you to build a society where all relationships are built on dignity, equity, and compassion. Thank you for listening. This project was made possible by funding provided by Santa Clara County Office of Gender-Based Violence Prevention.
This show is for informational purposes only and is not to be construed as legal advice. Always consult an attorney for legal advice. Views expressed by guests of the radio show are individual opinions and not endorsed by Maitri.
Maitri is a free, confidential, non-profit organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area that helps families and individuals facing domestic violence. Don't suffer in silence. Call Maitri Helpline 1-888-8-MAITRI, MAITRI. Visit our website maitri.org.